How will historians view the 2016 presidential election? Editorial board member Joe Rago stays with the show. Joe, you had a really fascinating op-ed. It was a series of interviews with historians, ran over the weekend. It's up on WSJ.com. Have we ever had an election like this with two candidates who were so disliked?
No, we haven't. And there's really just not a lot of precedents, at least for a candidate like Donald Trump. Some of these historians compared him to Andrew Jackson in the early 19th century, where you have to go back to find a campaign as negative as this one had been. Now, Jackson's wife died the same year he was elected, and he blamed the vitriol for the coronary that killed her. So it was a good lesson in perspective that it can always be worse.
Well, are there parts, though, of other presidential candidates that would help explain a Donald Trump? Like, for example, Pat Buchanan, an immigration restrictionist. I mean, you know, how do we understand Trump, not just with the Jackson comparison?
Sure. I mean, there's always been a populist tendency within the Republican coalition. If you go back to '92, Ross Perot drew on that a little bit with anti-trade sentiment. You can go back to Williams Jennings Bryan at the turn of the last century to look at kind of how a populist moment overtakes the country. And it's usually these periods of disruption and destabilization where these charismatic populists sort of rise up. The irony really is it's usually on the Democratic side rather than the Republican.
Well, let's talk about the Democratic side. Who do you compare Hillary Clinton to? Is she like a Nixon-like figure, kind of paranoid and secretive with a small circle around her? What
Sure. I mean, Nixon's habits of mind are probably the ones that most resemble Clinton's. I think she'd govern like LBJ with a focus on economic centralization, but you really don't have to go back very far than the Bill Clinton presidency to understand what a second Clinton presidency would be like, at least ethically speaking.
You know, what sense did you get from these conversations with the historians? You talked to a lot of them. Did they get a sense that this is really a crisis for the country, or did they say, you know, we've been through worse things before?
I mean, certainly there were some that said, look, this election is not like any other, but others said, well, look, it's not as bad as 1861 when we were actually killing each other.
Well, that's kind of a low bar, isn't it, Joe, the Civil War?
Well, sure, but this is kind of a low bar year. But the one point that they made sort of universally was, look, trust the U.S. system of government. You know, it's incredibly strong. The Federalist separation of powers will save us from whatever happens later tonight. And look, there's a lot of patriotism, decency, generosity that often recedes during hard-fought partisan campaigns. And once the election is over, those reserves will probably be reactivated to help us through the next 4 years.
Well, here's hoping. I know that you and Paul Gigot and Kim Strassel will be analyzing this on the Potomac Watch podcast, on iTunes, also tonight on the opinion page. We're going to run a blog, right?
That's right, Mary.
Great. WSJ.com/opinion. Joe Rago, thanks very much.
Thanks, Mary.
It's not just my name and my opponent's name on the ballot. It's the kind of country we want for our children and grandchildren. Is America dark and divisive, or hopeful and inclusive?
Welcome to Opinion Journal and happy Election Day. I'm Mary Kissel. The candidates have made their closing arguments in advance of voters going to the polls today. Editorial board member Joe Rago is here to talk about the pitch. So, Joe, that ad for Hillary Clinton, kind of gauzy, not a lot of talk about policy. Was that basically her whole campaign, to denounce Trump and to just talk about his temperament?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, she has not exactly run a hopeful, visionary campaign. It's really been about destroying Mr. Trump's temperament and character. I think that's the kind of ad she wanted to be running 2 weeks ago having wrapped it up before the FBI intervened. And of course, we should say that it takes two to tango, and the Trump campaign has not exactly been a model of civility or kindness, either generosity of spirit.
Well, let's play a clip from Trump's ad. Let's have a listen.
The establishment has trillions of dollars at stake in this election. For those who control the levers of power in Washington and for the global special interest, they partner with these people that don't have your good in mind.
So, Joe, kind of a gloomy vision there for Donald Trump. The entire system is rigged. Was that essentially the nut of his campaign?
Yeah, I mean, I think that distilled it perfectly into 30 seconds. I mean, look, he's running on a thesis that the traditional kind of optimistic, forward-looking presidential campaigns that we've seen are not winners. And he wants to speak to people's sense of destabilization and disaffection from the American political system.
Is that the irony here? You know, when you put those two ads side by side, that Hillary Clinton is bathed in a bright light and she's talking about unity and governing for all, and it's the Republican who's seen as the divider.
Yeah, I don't know if irony is quite the word. I think both candidates have not acquitted themselves very well, and I think a lot of people are going to the polls today and going, gosh, I don't know who I can vote for in this election.
Is it going to be all about turnout? Is that another big difference in how these campaigns have gotten their message out to the voting public?
Yeah, well, I mean, it always comes down to turnout. I think what you're seeing is in the early exits that we're starting to get, there's a sense of momentum for Hillary Clinton. Now, that will change over the day because the results are always back-weighted to match who actually turns out at the polls, demographics, and so forth. But I'm thinking it's going to be a late night.
Yeah, I think it could be too. Joe Rago, we're going to stay tuned. Thanks very much. If you're a voter who cares about foreign policy and American leadership abroad, for whom should you vote? Ambassador John Bolton, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, joins the show as he does regularly. So, Mr. Ambassador, let's start with the presidential candidates. Who's better on foreign policy?
Well, I think it's Trump. I think this urban legend that somehow Hillary will be more assertive, more interventionist than Obama is just flatly wrong. I don't think that's the mindset of the Democratic Party, whether it was Joe Biden or John Kerry or Hillary Clinton. I think they view the world the same way Obama does. And if you just simply take one thing out of Donald Trump, it's his pledge to rebuild the American military. Everything else is debatable. That is central, and I don't believe Hillary has said word one about the American military in this campaign. I might be wrong on that, but I haven't heard it.
Well, let's move to the Senate races. You've got a political action committee. Who has your PAC been supporting?
Well, we're doing independent expenditures for 3 candidates. With the PAC, the Super PAC, and a foundation I've raised about $12.5 million this year. We're doing very extensive work in 3 races: Richard Burr in North Carolina, Kelly Ayotte in New Hampshire, and Joe Heck in Nevada.
And why those 3 candidates? What makes them stand out versus the others?
Well, they are all candidates who, for different reasons, have very important positions on national security. They are in states where we thought the national security argument could make a difference, and they're in close races. I didn't set out to pick the 3 closest Senate races, but I'm afraid I may have succeeded in doing it. There are other candidates, John McCain in Arizona, obviously strong on national security. I thought he was going to win fairly easily. I think that's going to be the case. These 3 races will decide control of the U.S. Senate.
And one of those candidates, Kelly Ayotte, is a first-term senator, and yet she seems to have really distinguished herself when it comes to foreign policy.
She's done an outstanding job on the Senate Armed Services Committee. Her prior background as a prosecutor, I think, got her involved in some of the terrorism issues. She's facing a Democratic governor who has no experience on national security, and even worse, has no interest whatever in learning about it. So, to me, this is a critically important race.
Are there any House races that you're following, or is it mostly the Senate that matters?
Well, through the PAC, we have contributed almost $700,000 to 90 candidates around the country. but our resources are such we focused on the Senate because I concluded some time back Republicans would hold the House. I think that's going to eventuate, but the Senate was on a knife's edge then. It's on a knife's edge tonight.
And is foreign policy a bigger issue in this election than it was even back in 2012?
Well, I don't think so, and I'm a little surprised by that. I think the threat of international terrorism remains very much on people's minds, but I think this campaign has been dominated by the personalities of the candidates, for well or ill. I would say, though, that if the polls are right that Hillary Clinton is poised to win, these are three of several, but three critical races for people to say, I want to check and balance against a Hillary win by maintaining Republican control.
And I noticed that you didn't mention Marco Rubio in Florida, who's made his name on being a foreign policy hawk and also for standing up for human rights abroad.
Well, that's because I considered when I heard Rubio had gotten back into the race, I figured this is going to be easy. But I have helped him in contributions and done some emails for him and that sort of thing. But I really thought Rubio would win going away in Florida. I think he'll be okay. The question is whether he can bring Trump over the line and carry Florida for the presidency.
Well, we hope you'll join us again once we have a president-elect and we can talk about the makeup of the cabinet, Secretary of State, and the rest of it. John Bolton, thanks very much for joining.